All right, good morning. Uh, just Friday morning, so we only got one little section of notes today, and then vocab quiz. Here's your vocab quiz. It'll be posted here in just a second. We'll have vocab quiz, and then that'll be it for this weekend. No 5-question quiz or anything over the notes or anything. So just listen to the notes and do your vocab quiz. Have a good weekend. Let's do the notes right quick. Don't worry, it's just allergies and not corona. So if I'm sniffling, it's just allergies. I promise. I mowed the lawn today. So the red is the last one we're going over. We've already went over the green. We went over the yellow. Now let's go over the red, which is Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. This is what they call the Northeast in the book, Section 3, the Northeast. So Iraq, they call this Fertile Crescent. Why they call it the Fertile Crescent is because right in between the Tigris and the Euphrates is a very fertile soil. And so remember, where civilizations started are going to be good climate and next to water. And this is where that is. Okay. So this is a cultural hearth, meaning that this is where a lot of cultures started, a lot of cultures kind of went through and were, what's the word I'm looking for? Prosperous, very prosperous throughout this region. And so you have some of these you might recognize from the Bible: the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans. These are all biblical people that kind of gave the Israelites problems too. But they're all these ancient civilizations been around for a long time there. They built empires in this thing called Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia means the land between two rivers. So that's this area right here. Okay. There's a few places all throughout the world where major civilizations started. The Nile's one of them. The Mesopotamia is one of them. Some rivers in China is some of them. And Indus River Valley over here close to India is also another one. But Mesopotamia is where the one of the first ones started. Okay. Um, you have the Hittites. They covered modern Turkey, and they're famous for bringing us into the Iron Age and developing iron weapons. They kind of made their start here and then developed all the way up here into Turkey. Then you have the Persian Empire. If you've seen the movie 300, you know about the Persians. They fought wars with the Greeks, and so now you're getting around the time that the Greeks were there. So the Persians kind of prospered all throughout this Iran, all the way up to Turkey, and fought with the Greeks here. And then the Persians are very famous for their government structures and laws that they came up with. The Persians are known for those things. Okay. Some also people there that live there today. You have a lot of different ethnic groups that live there today. It's not like most of them are Muslim, meaning that they are followers of Islam, but they're not just mainly um, one ethnic group. They're all over the place. You got Turks and Kurds and Persians. They have different languages besides Arabic. Usually, if you're Islamic, you speak Arabic, but these Islamic people speak Turkish or Farsi over there in some of these other places outside of the the countries we talked about last, place next to the Mediterranean. You have all of them are Islamic except for the Assyrians, but tensions exist. Why do tensions exist between people in the same religion? Well, it's because that you have usually these two groups inside of Islam. You're either Sunni or you're Shiite. Okay. Um, you after Muhammad died, the leader of Islam, after he died, the Muslims divided into two branches. You had Sunni and Shiite. So what's the difference between the two? Okay, this video is going to talk very briefly about that.
The terms Sunnis and Shiites get thrown around a lot when discussing Middle Eastern conflicts. Sometimes it's useful, but most of the time it feels like it's just shorthand for these people hate each other. But with over 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, there's no way they can all be involved in some Hatfields and McCoy-style blood feud. So what's really going on here? Well, first of all, not all Sunnis and Shiites are at war with each other. There are tons of places where they coexist peacefully, like the United Arab Emirates, or Dearborn, Michigan, for example. It's also worth noting that their religions aren't diametrically opposed. In fact, the Sunni-Shiite conflict isn't even really about religion, it's about power. Originally, Muslims were all one group, unified under the Prophet Muhammad. Then, in the year 632, Muhammad died, and Muslims split off into two separate groups. The Sunnis wanted Muhammad's successor to be chosen by his community of followers, while the Shiites wanted the leadership to stay within the Prophet's family. The Sunnis were in the majority, so they chose their new leader to be the Caliph, which is basically the head of state. The Shiites did not recognize this new leader, and instead, they chose Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali, as their new imam, which also basically means head of state. That was the main source of divide, and from there, things really only got worse. Early on, most of the Shiite imams met violent ends at the hands of the stronger Sunni caliphs, including Imam Ali's son, Hussein, whose beheading is still considered a major holiday for Shiite Muslims. Today, there are numerous Sunni and Shiite militant groups, terrorist organizations, and oppressive governments. Being Sunni or Shiite doesn't necessarily make you a member or even a supporter of those groups, but they're still divided up that way. In fact, every nation with Sunni-Shiite conflicts has large militant groups on both sides, and they all have a history of oppressing one another depending on who's currently in power. Iraq, for example, was run by an oppressive Shiite regime before Saddam, then an oppressive Sunni regime under Saddam, followed by an oppressive Shiite regime once again after Saddam left power. Now the oppressive Sunni militant group ISIS is threatening to take over huge parts of the country. So you can see that the Sunni-Shiite conflicts are more about power, politics, and retribution than actual religion. And truthfully, the words Sunni and Shiite aren't even the best words to use when discussing Sunni-Shiite conflicts. They are way too general. If you're talking about militant jihad.
All right, so you can see there that Sunni and Shiite difference is power. One wants it to be a democratic way of picking the leader, and one wants it to be almost a hereditary monarchy way of picking the leader. You can see here that most of the Muslims are Sunni, but you can be either one. And just because you're one doesn't mean you hate the other one. They get along. Even in our school, you have different Sunnis and Shiite. So it doesn't really mean that you hate each other, but they do fight against each other. And more in the Middle East than anywhere else do they not get along as well in the Middle East. You can have different governments and oppressive people. You can have different terrorist organizations that will be Sunni or Shiite. It doesn't mean that either one of them are. And just because you are Sunni or Shiite doesn't mean that you're part of a terroristic association, obviously. That's like saying I'm a Christian and I kill people in the Crusades. That's not what it means, obviously. So that's the difference between the two. Okay, so the Kurds are these people that live all throughout Turkey and Iraq and Iran. They really don't have a state. They're a stateless group. Okay, they've never really had a home territory to call their own home state. And so they live on these other people's lands. They were promised land after World War One. If they helped the French and British in World War One, they were promised to get land. But then the French and British didn't give them land. And so they were just kind of this people that lived in these territories and wanted representation but never really got it. Iran has a lot of refugees. So these people, whenever the Sunnis came into power, the Shiites fled persecution and go to Iran, and Iran helped kind of kept protecting them because they were mostly Shiite people while the Iraq was Sunni. And so you have a lot of war. You have African refugees that are all trying to go because of the war in Afghanistan. It's been going on since 2001, basically. And they're fighting usually these militant groups that have come into power. When one goes out of power, usually another one pops up in the power. So like when the Taliban went out of power, then you had the ISIS that we just kind of have learned about in the last 5 or 6 years. You heard and talked about ISIS. They came into power after other countries like Taliban went out of power. Okay, and they're all usually fighting over power, and sometimes they're fighting over the land because the land is very rich in oil. And so Iran and Iraq fight over oil during the 1980s, and then Iraq invades Kuwait to try and get their oil in 1990. And the rest of the world helped fight off the Iraq and Saddam Hussein in the Persian Gulf in the early 90s when I was a baby. Then you have the Taliban. The Taliban's one you might have heard of, being a post September 11th child that you are. The Taliban was the people that were in charge and kind of behind the attacks on September 11th. They're a very militant, fundamentalist Muslim group. They're very extremist, and they took power. They were a government group that took power in Afghanistan in the 80s and 90s, and got more and more powerful going up through the 90s. And so they ruled, and they helped protect this guy, Osama bin Laden. He was came from a rich family, but then Osama bin Laden started going to these fundamentalist ideas that the Taliban had. The Taliban had these really extreme views on how things should be ran, how women should be ran, how much that they didn't like the West and America in general. So Osama bin Laden used their protection and their money to help fund and had the 9/11 attacks, which then they attacked. We invade Afghanistan, and we try to get rid of the Taliban out of Afghanistan. We remove them from power from 2002, but they've been fighting back and get power sometimes, then we kick them back out of power. We're never going to get rid of all terrorists. We talked about that earlier in the year. Okay, Osama bin Laden is eventually found and killed, and most of the Taliban head leaders are killed by the mid 2000s. Saddam Hussein's another good example of this. Saddam Hussein was the leader of Iraq, and he was ordered after the Gulf War in the early 90s to get rid of his biological weapons and his chemical weapons. He mustard gas people and killed people, the Kurd people that we talked about. He just killed them with mustard gas because he didn't like them living on his land in Iraq. So he killed them, and that's against the war. That's a war crime. And so he's ordered to destroy chemical weapons, biological weapons. We think he has weapons of mass destruction, which are nuclear bombs. We think he has those. So President Bush, after we get out of our kind of defeat the Taliban in Afghanistan, we start to invade Iraq to get rid of him and find his bombs. We ended up finding him, and he was living in a basement looking like this, and his own people put him on trial and hung him after he was found. So what's going on there today? Well, they're making progress. Turkey is trying to develop water resources, hydroelectric plants to give energy and have help with irrigation and growing things. They produce steel. They're a very good location with Europe and Asia and the Middle East. So they're that cultural crossroads right here where a lot of people are. Iran is trying to change their government around to help bring more stability. With more stability brings more economic success. The government there currently helps support change, and they're finding oil there, which helps as well. You can see right here on the edge of the Persian Gulf. But every time they take 2 steps forward, it's like they're taking 1 step back. Usually they take 2 steps forward, the government does well, and then some terrorist group comes in and overthrows or tries to take land like ISIS. And so you have food shortages and medicine shortages after the Gulf War and limiting trade in Iraq because we're punishing them for their crimes that they did. And so it limits those things. Afghanistan is one of the world's poorest nations. People farm or herd, and you remember your third world country, most of your major production is done in agriculture and not in services like what we are. So it's underdeveloped because of instability. The post-Taliban government is trying to rebuild the economy, make things better, but I mean, it's hard to do. Like I said, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. They're not progressing as fast as they can because of all the turmoil that goes on there. And that's what this is talking about. This regions, nations face internal struggles. They want modern lifestyle while some people want to go and live on the old traditions. The Taliban had very strict rules on behavior for women, especially. Women couldn't leave the home without a husband. They couldn't, when they left, they had to cover everything from head to toe. Women couldn't use the internet or be in the same room as men unless their husband allowed them to be, and so they're very strict on behavior. No dancing or clapping or whistling and things like that. So you have these groups that they're trying to transition from those fundamentalist extreme views. Taliban-like groups in Turkey and Iraq and Iran have gained power. That's not have not, but have gained power like ISIS and other things. And so it's just political problems. All right, I think that's it. Yep. So these notes are on Google Classroom. Just remember to take your vocab quiz and have a good weekend.